Welcome everyone to Module 10, Hiring the Right People. In our last session, we discussed conflict resolution. A lot of the problems that arise in the workplace are created because organizations do not pay enough attention in the first place to the hiring process. Today's session will discuss the process that will help ensure you have the best chance of hiring the right people. Of course, needless to say, there are no guarantees in this area. It's all a matter of probability. Our goal is to maximize the probability that you will make the right hire. Before we get into process, I want to talk about culture. The culture of an organization is a critical factor in the hiring process. It's sometimes overlooked, often overlooked. A mismatch between the candidate and the culture of the organization can lead to a bad experience. So what do I mean by culture? Defining an organization's culture is very difficult. It's a hard concept to put your arms around. It defies precise definition. But I'll attempt to provide some clarity. For those of you who have been in the workforce, you know that each organization has certain norms, certain ways of doing things, certain ways people interact with one another. Many years ago, I worked for one of the leading defense contractors in the country, Grumman Aerospace Corporation, a great corporation. This company built a culture of serving its employees that was so strong that every attempt to unionize the manufacturing workers, fell flat. I could call any employee in the company, ask for a document or a bit of information, and get a quick and friendly response. The CEO of the company could routinely be seen on the cafeteria line in Plant 5. Employees took enormous pride working for the company that put a man on the moon in 1969 and later built 4 of the 5 aircraft on every carrier in the Navy's fleet, including the greatest jet fighter ever built, the F-14. You may detect a bit of Grumman pride in my voice, even though it's been 26 years since I worked there. The reason is Grumman worked hard at building a culture where 25,000 employees felt like one family. Here's another example. Not long ago I read an article of Microsoft, the culture of Microsoft. The article noted that Microsoft lost its dominance in the tech sector during the 2000s to companies like Google, Apple, and Amazon. And they lost their dominance because the culture of innovation that had earlier defined Microsoft was surpassed by a business culture that focused on maximizing profits. Microsoft is now trying to get back to innovation. So what is the culture of your organization? Is it team-oriented? Does it value employees who are good people persons, people who connect with others on an emotional level? Does it encourage new ideas or just different ways of implementing the old ideas? I worked for many years in the national health charities, and I came to know many people who also worked in this sector at different organizations. There's a definite type of person who works for organizations like St. Jude Hospital or JDRF or the MS Society or the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. It's someone who really enjoys being around people, someone who is comfortable on a major gift meeting, but who can also put on a baseball cap and a t-shirt and go to a walkathon. Somebody who can work a room at a gala, who has high octane in their system. That's the culture of the national health charities. When I used to hire people, I would say I want people with PhDs, people who are passionate, hungry, and determined. This fit not only the organizational culture I was in, but it also fit my management style. So you need to do some kind of assessment of your organizational culture to make sure you hire people that will fit in well. So let's take a look at the hiring process. Here are 9 steps in the hiring process. It begins with a job description, what to look for in a resume, the initial phone screening interview, the initial in-person interview, a second round in-person interview, if necessary a third round, a check of references, background check, and then the offer. So let's take these one at a time, starting with the job description. Does it clearly state what the priorities for the position are? Is it free of the clutter that often obscures priorities? Too often job descriptions try to include everything about the job. They end up obscuring what is really important. Does the job description establish the core competencies? For example, strong written and verbal communication skills, the ability to effectively establish relationships. Does the job description state the performance expectations? Maybe it's an annual fundraising goal. This is important because when you invite a candidate in, or just even prior to the initial phone screening interview, you're going to want to send a job description. And we're going to talk about resumes in a moment. But you want your job description to be free of clutter and to be very straightforward about the type of person you want and the nature of the job. So what do we look for in a resume? Is it well organized? Again, is it free of clutter? I've looked at thousands of resumes. I advise many people today on their resume. The number one mistake people make is that their resume is cluttered. Way too much information. What that ends up doing is burying what is really important with unimportant information. So is the resume written clearly? Are there vague statements like created innovative multi-channel strategies that supported value-based initiatives? Nobody knows what that means. Or are there clear statements like raised $3 million last fiscal year, an increase of 17% over the previous year? Can you readily determine the positions held and the accomplishments at each organization where the candidate worked? Does the resume include something about the person's attributes, skills, and experience? Attributes describe who you are, skills describe what you can do, and experience describes what you have done. So after checking resumes, there's some number of candidates. Hopefully it's a good pool of candidates, but you're going to want to conduct an initial phone screening interview. This is a 15 to 20 minute call. It's designed to get an initial sense of who the candidate is by listening for their ability to communicate well, to communicate with poise and confidence. It should also be used to inform the candidate of the position's salary range. Both candidates for positions and organizations tend to be vague about salary. I think it's important to be upfront because otherwise you're wasting the other person's time and you're wasting your time if the two parties are not in the same salary range. If the candidate is looking for $100,000 and your position pays $75,000, it's better to address this discrepancy immediately. And by the way, be wary of hiring someone who is seeking significantly more money than you are offering. In other words, someone who is willing to come down significantly, 25, 30, 50% in salary. They may say, well, for the right position, I'm willing to come down in salary. But once they're hired, they're going to find it difficult to go back to responsibilities that they have already, the types of responsibilities that they've already had in previous jobs. In other words, going back to things that they've done and compensation levels where they've already been. So assuming coming out of the initial phone screening, let's say hypothetically you called 8 people and there were 5 that you thought were sounded good on the phone and that also met your were in the same salary range that you, they were seeking the same salary range that you're offering. Now it's time for the in-person interview. I used to like to have what I would call the first round interview. This is where I would take a pool of candidates, 3, 4, 5, and speak with them for 30 to 45 minutes. The purpose of this interview is to see the candidate in action. Do they have poise? Do they speak with confidence? Did they show up on time and properly dressed? What does their body language tell you? When probing their resume, can they back up all of their claims? The initial interview is also your opportunity to sell your organization. Keep in mind that the candidates are measuring you too. They will be assessing whether you meet their expectations for the kind of manager or the kind of organization or the kind of work environment they want in their job. So these interviews, as I mentioned, are 30 to 45 minutes, and they're designed to help you narrow the field to a smaller number of candidates that you want to have come back for a much deeper interview. By the way, when setting up the initial interview, make sure that the candidate knows that this is a first round and that it'll be 30, maybe 45 minutes. And that you'll be conducting these interviews with several other candidates and then subsequently narrowing the field down to 2 or 3 final candidates who will come back for the second round interview. So let's talk about that second round interview. So candidates who make it through the first 2 rounds, or I should say through the initial screening and then the first round interview, will come back. And here's where you want to have an in-depth discussion of the candidate's experience, what they've done, how they will fit into your organization, what motivates them. It's also a good idea to have a panel-style interview. Have 3, 4, I've done it with as many as 6 other people in the room. This will allow you to better observe the candidate, and it will give you some other opinions on the candidate once the interview is over. Of course, if you're going to have a panel interview, it's your job to make sure that the people coming in to serve on the panel are thoroughly briefed. In addition to briefing all of the other candidates for the second round interview, you of course have to carefully plan it out. You want to have prepared questions designed to inform you on how the candidate has handled difficult situations, or how the candidate was able to effect change in his or her previous jobs, or what are the driving forces that motivate the candidate. One of the best questions I was asked as a job candidate one time was one of the simplest questions: what makes you tick? What makes you tick? It really made me think deeply into what are the forces that motivate me. What are the things from my earliest childhood that were instilled in me that still motivate me today? One of the things I always tried to look for when I was interviewing a candidate was to discover whether they had a commitment to success, a drive to achieve. I always wanted to distinguish this between a commitment to a particular cause. I really was not much interested if they had a passion for our mission. That sounds sacrilegious. It was enough for me if they could believe in the mission. What I wanted was a passion for success. I wanted somebody, as I mentioned earlier, with PhD, who was passionate, hungry, and determined, who had a commitment to excellence. If necessary, you might want to conduct a third round of interviews. This is if you have 2 candidates who are very close and you want to bring them back one more time. Again, you're going to have to carefully craft your questions. They should not be repeat questions from the first go-around. They can even be as straightforward as the following. We've narrowed this down to 2 candidates. You're one of the finalists. We're happy that you are still interested in our position. Tell me, why should we hire you? Leave it up to the candidate to make a final case for himself or herself. So once we have settled on a candidate, it's time to conduct references and background check. These 2 final steps involve checking the person's, the references are not as revealing as they once were. Checking references is not as revealing. Laws now discourage former employers from saying anything negative about a candidate. About all you can expect from these calls is confirmation that the person worked during the years stated on his resume and achieved the accomplishments stated on his resume. If you can affirm that, then that's fine. Now, of course, a former employee, if they have good things to say about a candidate, then that's obviously worth noting. A good question to ask is, would you rehire this candidate? The background check is now commonly done to ensure the candidate has no prior criminal record, has nothing on his or her credit report that would make you concerned over handling money, and has nothing on his or her driving record that would prevent her from driving a car, prevent him from driving a car, if that is part of the job. And it's also, the background check is also used to verify employment history and academic degrees. Background checks are normally outsourced to a company specializing in the field, and reference checks, I've also noted, increasingly are going in that direction also, of being outsourced. So once the reference checks are done and once the background check is done, it's time to make the offer. Now I should note here, sometimes organizations will make the offer first, the candidate will accept, and then the organization will say, okay, your employment here and acceptance of our position or your employment here is contingent upon clearing the references and the background check. So some organizations now will do both of those after the offer rather than before the offer. So let's say, but let's say for argument's sake here, we've completed the reference check and the background check, and now we're going forward to making the offer. This is the best part of the whole process. Many HR departments, if they're involved in the interview process, will reserve this privilege for themselves. But if at all possible, you as the manager should have the joy of offering the position to the candidate you selected. At a minimum, if the HR department insists on making that first phone call, you should follow with a call right away saying congratulations to the candidate. Just a note on negotiation. This comes up from time to time. I always prefer to be upfront with every candidate early in the process that I had very little or no wiggle room on compensation. If the position called for a salary in the $100,000 to $110,000 range, that's what I would stick with. Only if I had an obvious top performer, someone who was head and shoulders above every other candidate, and that person needed additional compensation, only then would I seek some additional budget and make a case for exceeding my budget. Let me add here that you should call every candidate who you interviewed in person. Not only is it a nice gesture, you never know when you might be calling on these candidates again. Again, these are the people who did not get the job. You will be surprised how enormously grateful they are when you make that phone call. And you never know when you might be calling them back and making them an offer. I had one memorable experience when candidate number one reneged on a commitment days before she was supposed to start. I went back to candidate number two, who accepted our offer. It all worked out. So that brings us to the end of Module 10. To sum up, the hiring process is time-consuming, it's methodical. Knowing your organization's culture, knowing the type of person that will fit into your organization, being able to, the candidate being able to make the strong case for himself or herself, going through a rigorous interview, rigorous multi-step interview process. It's all time-consuming. But if you follow these steps, you'll give yourself the best chance of hiring the right person. Thank you, and we'll see you in Module 11.